everybody, and welcome to today's Secure Ideas Professionally Evil webcast. That's a mouthful.
Yay!
Woo!
Sorry.
Yeah. So we're gonna. Oops. Sorry. I'll just keep doing that. So I'm your moderator today, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna go through the web application attack classification BILE. It's an idea that Jason Gillum has been working on for a while now. I feel like a poet. And what we thought was that Jason and Jennifer being one of our senior consultants and core web penetration testers here at Secure Ideas, could answer some questions about what BILE is, how it works, how we use it, and then go from there. So if you have any questions or conversations, things like that, please don't hesitate to write them in the chat. We're here. Of course, afterwards, you can always join us in the Professional Evil Slack channel or reach out to any one of us with questions. So before we get started, I think, Jason, I guess we are getting started. Jason, can you explain the BILE classification scheme and what BILE stands for?
Sure. Okay. Now, do you want me to go into the details of how we got here yet, or just what it is?
No, what it is. I think we should start with what it is. Because, look, let me be very clear. The very first time you came to me and said, I have BILE, I wanted to write back and just say, yeah, we all do. It's natural.
Exactly.
Nexium will help with that. Not a sponsor.
So, fair enough. Okay, so I think of this as a classification scheme more than anything else. I mean, you might call it a model or a framework or what have you, but it's kind of a higher level classification scheme. And I'm going to move on to the next slide here because it actually breaks down what each part means.
Good idea.
So there we go. The BILE classification scheme. We don't have a whole lot of slides, by the way. There's like 4, including the title slide. So this isn't a slide heavy presentation. So there's 4 parts to this classification scheme, and the purpose behind these is to classify the testing activities that we perform during a web application pen test. They're basically broken down as, BILE, or the 4. We like our acronyms in InfoSec, so we had to come up with something fancy. So we have bypass, input manipulations, or that could also be injections, I suppose, but I prefer to think of it as the activity, which is we're manipulating the input. Logic and timing based attacks, and then looking for information exposure, and that's what that last one is, exposure.
Yep, that makes sense. I actually I think that's a key point that you just said, that when you first started talking to us about it, and I know, Jennifer, we were talking about this, and you commented the same way, is that this is not focused on what the flaw is, but what the activity in looking for it is. Right? Because I'll be blunt, and we all know that I'm the dumbest person in the room, but every time I think about it, I have to think about the fact that it's not injection. Right, because we're so focused on injection when we talk about web vulnerabilities, app vulnerabilities, stuff like that. So I guess you actually asked about it already, and I think it's a good next question. Is what prompted you to do this? And I hesitate to say the word prompt because, of course, that makes us think ChatGPT, and that's the next webcast.
One of my other favorite topics.
So why did you develop this? And as part of that, why did you develop it? What do you think should happen? How do you think other people should help with this? And we'll dig into that more, I think, later.
Yeah, sure. So it's there's not really an interesting story behind this. This is one of those things that has evolved over time, and it's been a combination of the training that we do, and we've been doing web app pen test training for years. Actually,
as long as more
over
years
a decade.
We've been, more years than we've been in business.
Exactly. And that is where a lot of this sort of you kind of gradually came together as a formal way of thinking about this, because we already have a process, right? We have our standard pen testing process. But what this sort of prompted this was when we got to the point where we're talking about the different broad categories of vulnerabilities that we are looking for in applications. I mean, we have the OWASP top 10, and that's one way to categorize these. That one shifts all the time. Yeah. But when we're trying to train people, okay, what are the things that you need to be thinking about when you're going through a test? We kept sort of forming these 4 groupings that we would keep all of that training kind of together. And I figured there had to be some reason why we kept gravitating towards that. And then I also found that for me personally, when I was doing a web app pen test, I would similarly kind of change my frame of mind 4 different ways as I was going through an application and look. And these were essentially what I was looking for. We've had different names. If you've taken any of our professional evil application security training classes in the past, then we've talked about all of these. We might not have called them the same things that we call them in BILE, but ultimately that's what it's come down to, is these 4 categories. So I don't know if I fully answered the question. Was there another part to that?
No, I think you did. I'm a little disappointed that there isn't a superhero origin story around BILE. Right.
You should ask ChatGPT to write an origin story for you.
I think that's a good idea, right?
Yeah.
I could probably do that.
So I do have to point out, as one of the project leads for Samurai WTF, as the creator of Samurai WTF, we know that the WTF acronym was thought of first, and then we figured out what it would stand for. So I have to ask, BILE is a pretty memorable acronym. What did
legitimately?
Yeah, how did you work that out? And are there other ones coming, like vomit or whatever next?
No, there's no. As far as I know, I don't have any plans for a vomit acronym. I know that for BILE, really the only other one that I seriously considered is not very exciting at all. It would have been changing the L to a T, bite. But
I like BILE better.
I remember you saying that you like BILE better, and that was one of the main reasons I kept it. So,
well, in that case, yeah, if Kevin likes it, we might have likes it.
We're gonna go with that one.
So the next question I have, and Jennifer, if you don't mind, I'm gonna throw this at you a little bit.
Let's do it.
Mainly because I know Jason mentioned the P's course. I know you also are our primary author of our API security course and help with the P's course as an author and as one of our primary instructors. So as you look at the 4 categories, right? Those 4 categories, do you think you could give us a little bit more information of how you view them, right? Does that make sense?
Like a little bit more of a breakdown on how I treat it in the test.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I actually really liked about BILE, and I've been really enthusiastic about since I first saw Jason introduce it, was one thing that a lot of people who aren't pen testers might not understand is that there's a very circular nature to a pen test. If I find something, sure, we can easily say we're going to start with recon, then we're going to map, then we're going to look at it, then we're going to inject. But sometimes that process leads us back to, okay, well, I found this server that I didn't know anything about before, and I don't know anything about the service running on it. So now I got to do research on that, and we circle back around. One of the things that I really like about BILE is that it makes it a lot easier to kind of break down the little bits and pieces that you have to do. So if I find something interesting, okay, well, what controls are in place here? What ways can I bypass them? What are some areas that maybe they aren't as strict as they should be? Or what input does it take? Not every build takes input, but if there's input, what can I do with it? What does it come back with? Can I get errors?
Yeah.
And that's what I like about it, is that it makes it a lot easier, I think, to kind of simplify the circular nature of it, because then I can look at all of the fields as I'm going. Because what do you think about it? Like, one search function, as far as all of the things that can go through, you're like, okay, well, injection. Can I get too much information back? What can I do with it? And it breaks it down.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I like. I'm gonna call out your, explanation to somebody who's not a pen tester about the circular nature, because I know that I run into this all the time. As one of the people that does a lot of our sales, for the lack of a salesperson, which may be resolved soon. But as somebody who talks quite often to people who are not penetration testers but are looking to have that assessment, that is something that people seem to misunderstand with the way we present pen testing as an industry. Is that people think of it as this linear process. I'm going to do this, then this. Jason, how many times do we see people ask us, can you tell us what you'll be testing when during the test?
Oh, yeah. Sure. I'll get right on that.
I find very often the path I took to get to an exploit more closely resembles my hairbrush than a line.
Brian wants to hear how we resolved the sales FTE situation. It's real simple. We sent out an offer letter earlier today. We are hoping they will accept the offer letter, and that will solve the sales FTE position. We actually have a candidate that we're really excited about that I'm not going to name right now in case they don't accept it.
Yes. We haven't heard back yet. So
yeah, we haven't heard back yet. So cool. I guess, Jennifer, you started to talk a little bit about this, so I'm gonna throw it back at Jason a little bit. And actually, I'd look for both of you to answer this. Can you give us maybe an anecdote of a test? Obviously, we can't say when we were hacking the Pentagon or something like that, right? That was a joke for the recording. But obviously, we can't talk about a specific customer and give details like that. But could you give us a real world testing scenario where you were able to make the test better because of BILE, or maybe make the results of the test better because of BILE?
Okay. It's hard for me to narrow this down to a single one, because I apply this across everything that I do. I think I can come up with, like, sometimes you have one of those tests where you find a flaw that's not a typical flaw that you would expect. Mm-hmm. So it's maybe not something that's directly listed on the OWASP top 10, but it's still something that falls into one of these categories. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. That makes sense.
One that I'm really thinking about here is I recall I did a test. I don't know. I think it was a couple years ago. So this was from a little while ago. I still can't say who it was, but
those people.
But it was a little while ago, and you'll remember this one, I think, because we've used it as an example before, where we had a login mechanism on a web application, and there was an injection point in a hidden field in that login form. Now, the first thing that you might be thinking is, oh, injection. Well, I can do a cross-site scripting attack on that. That sounds great. But it turned out that this particular application had actually a fairly strong content security policy on there. So although it could inject JavaScript onto the page, it would not actually run. It would, there'd be an error in the console and it wasn't going to do anything. So it was, at that point, it's back to the drawing board. And so in hindsight, if I was thinking BILE at the time, again, remember, this is something that's evolved over time. We called it different things. But I would be thinking, okay, well, I can't do the thing I thought I could do. Now let's start back at the beginning and think, okay, is there other ways to, bypass on there? It's not really a bypass thing. There's still input manipulation, though. We have that. There must be something else we can do with the input manipulation. And then we'd also consider, is there timing related or logic related or any information exposure? Those don't really apply in this particular case because this is on a login page. We don't have the information yet, or information because we're still trying to get past the login. So in the end, what I ended up doing is basically using HTML injection to change the form on the page. So I closed out the existing form because remember this was a hidden form that had an injection point in it, and so I was able to change that entire form to hide it, and then kept injecting HTML to open a second form, which was exactly the same as the first one. So the only difference is that it submitted the form to my server instead of the relative one from where the form was. So I think that's a good example of kind of how this plays out.
I like that.
Yeah, it all gets down to it's to me it's the frame of mind, and that's also actually what Jennifer was when you were talking through your examples and the circular nature of it is exactly the same thing. All right, it's like, okay, let's think about in this frame of mind, this other frame of mind, like what are the possible things that we need to consider.
I like the frame of mind context. This is something back when I was at InGuardians, back when I used to teach for the SANS and would talk to people, very often I would discuss the fact that we are glorified QA testers.
Oh, yes. I say that a lot, actually.
Yeah. And then the difference is how we think about the finding we have, what we do with it after we find it. And I think, Jennifer, if I could ask you, because you come from a different background than Jason and I, right? Jason and I both come from development, building stuff, administration, what have you. Whereas, most recently, your job was more detection, monitoring, things like that. So if I could throw out there, if you're working with an organization that is in a SOC or in their SDLC, what have you, do you have any recommendations on ways that they could leverage BILE as part of that existing security practice? Excuse me.
Oh, yes, absolutely. That is actually a really good question. And I absolutely think that is something that you could keep in mind as far as like the more defensive side of things. And now I have an idea for like further discussions around this, because that's actually really interesting because
like Jennifer now has 6 blogs that she has to write.
I have another talk. Well, let's go. I already submitted my talk idea for next week. Dang. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of ways that they could absolutely use that. And off the top of my head, like the logic and typing side of things. And if I remember correctly, I think a lot of that and exposure kind of really lay into the insufficient logging sections in the OWASP top 10.
That's a good point. Yeah.
One thing that I have always preached in every talk I've ever given, and I've been doing a lot of talks about API and API security lately because, like Kevin said, I'm one of the authors and lead instructors for the API class. Being aware of what you have exposed is a huge advantage to anyone who is looking to strengthen their own internal security. Because I find more often than not, like when we go into an organization, both from the defensive side and the offensive side, that they wouldn't always be aware of all of the endpoints they have exposed, or a lot of times with API specifically, it's very common for me to see, we have a query for users, and then current users, and then deleted users, and it's going to be V1 current users, V2 current users, and then V3 current users. And I find pretty often that I can still access the V1 and V2 functionalities, even though they're currently on version 3. Yeah. And the reason why they've upgraded to version 3 is there's all sorts of issues with the lower versions, but they're still publicly exposed. I can still access them. They're just not in the documentation anymore.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Now I'm going to take that same question and I'm going to twist it back at you, Jason, from thinking back to your previous job where you were one of the people involved in AppSec at an architecture level as a team guiding other teams. How would you take BILE and make that part of what an architecture team would push out?
That's actually a great perspective on that. I hadn't really thought about that.
Oh, good.
I'm on the spot here. I got to think about this.
I know. That's how I felt a minute ago. But as soon as he said it, I was like, "Why have I not thought about that? That's brilliant. That's a really good idea."
Well, here's the thing. I think one of the key points with BILE right from the beginning. I mean, Kevin, you've known me for a long time. I like to get us to a point where things are simplified. Yeah. Right, where it's easy and repeatable, and that's I think really important with everything you're doing. So that is something that would translate, I think, very well to a security architecture role as well. So when you're designing something or looking at something new, you could use this as a way to help evaluate that. I don't know. I'm backtracking a little bit now because I don't want this to become a
brainstorm session.
It's not a threat modeling tool is what I'm getting at. I don't want it. I don't think it's really intended to become a threat modeling tool. You have tools like Stride that are already there for that. So it is more about thinking through the different frame of mind from a tester perspective. Now here's the difference though. If you look at Stride, it's the way that everything is written in this, that's Microsoft's threat modeling. They classify it as a threat modeling model, I guess.
Threat model.
But
DNS server.
It's very like blue team oriented, right? So very defender focused. BILE isn't. It's very much from the attacker's perspective, if I'm looking at an application and I see this piece of functionality here, I can evaluate it. Are there controls that can be bypassed? Is there input that can be manipulated? Are there logic or timing aspects to this that could be abused? Is there information being exposed? That's really what BILE is, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
In a nutshell. So I think from an architecture perspective, one thing I didn't do very well before I got into information security, I was in enterprise architecture, but I didn't do very well is actually putting myself in that attacker's mindset. And I think BILE can help do that. It's like, okay, stop thinking defensively, start thinking, put yourself in the attacker's shoes and think about these things.
Well, and I actually laugh when you say that because that is so often the biggest switch for people as we hire. Secure Ideas is almost 13 years old. And previous to Secure Ideas, I was at InGuardians, and maybe I should be concerned at how easily I understood that difference in that mindset. Yeah. But one of the things I've seen consultants that get hired struggle with very often is that switch. We'll pick on Eric here, right? Eric Keene, one of our principal consultants, he came from building Active Directory infrastructure and doing all that kind of stuff. And we actually pursued him as a consultant. We wanted to hire him. We wanted to have him come on board. And his biggest hang up, that's probably not the right word, but I'm not sure what the right word would be, was the fear that he didn't know that mindset, that he wouldn't be able to take what he did as a defender and make it offensive without just cursing. And we see this quite often when we talk to people, right? We will tell them a flaw, we'll tell them what the issue is, but they won't actually understand the risk because they don't understand that mindset. I mean, how many times do we have a person, not our direct customer, but the person on their staff or whatever, who will argue back about something? Well, that's not that big a deal because, well, we had it this morning, right, Jason? Not a customer, somebody we were talking to in a completely unrelated thing, and they came back and actually made the comment, well, nobody's attacking us, we're small.
Oh yeah.
And exactly, both Jason and I cringed, right? Like, it was like, oh, don't say that.
Yeah.
No. And it's completely around the idea that they don't understand the attacker mindset, right? So I think that's interesting. I'm gonna oh, dang it, I'm sorry. I think
I actually
we have a good question here. When applying BILE, and I don't know if the question goes into the chat, into the recording, so I'm going to read it. When applying BILE, do you tend to try to look at things from each of the BILE's perspectives as you look at each element, function, feature of an app? Or do you also attempt to look at the full app from a single perspective per iteration?
So I'm just going to jump in there. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm curious what your perspective is.
So I was actually, because I know we were talking a little bit earlier about how we've used BILE in testing, and I think it's a combination of the two. I need to, whenever I'm first interacting with an application, I'm kind of taking it all in, learning. My first action in any pen test is learning how to use the application as it's intended to be used by a normal user. Because once I understand all of those functions and how it's intended to be used, then I can start really looking at how to break it down from there. But I find it's really good when you're getting the overall picture, but it's a lot better when you start diving into the nitty gritty. And one of the favorite things I have ever done, very common, we almost always end up testing in the login functionality in web apps, unless it's out of scope for some reason or another. And so the first thing I'm doing whenever I'm looking at the login functionality is, okay, what inputs here? Can I bypass it? Is there a way for me to get access to a different user's account? What happens if I create a user with the same username and password? What is it going to do? And what input is it taking? And there was this one app where I wasn't finding anything really with the login functionality. There weren't any major glaring issues. And I'm moving through the BILE process with each stage. First, I'm focusing on the username, and then I'm focusing on the password. But when you put in a proper username and password, you get sent an email with a MFA token in it. It was just 6 digits long. And I noticed that this MFA token, in one of the errors I got back, that they were valid for like 30 minutes, which is a really long time for an MFA token to be valid for. And then I found out that there was no rate limiting. There was rate limiting for username and password input. So after I put in too many attempts there, it would say, sorry, that's too many requests. You have to stop. We're going to block you for like 15 minutes. So I couldn't brute force it. But there wasn't any rate limiting on the page asking for my MFA token. And I was able to set up a quick script that went through a bunch of, I forgot how many it went through in a short time period. And for the sake of testing and not overloading the client, I kind of narrowed it down and cheated a little bit. But it was a proof of concept, a proof that I could do it. And I brute forced MFA after something like 800 failed MFA tokens. It let me in.
Nice.
So if I understand it correctly, really the answer, synopsisized, is that you do both.
Yeah.
Is that you first start by looking at the entire app from the app as a whole for each of the 4 things, and then you dig into each of the functionalities and do it from there. So Jason, do you have a different approach? Because this is one of the nice things I always find when I talk to pen testers or anybody else, but is that 2 people who are both effective at what they do approach it from different ways.
Different ways, yeah. I would say that absolutely you can apply it both ways, either like holistically, one of those perspectives at a time. Or you could, you can look at, a particular function from the 4 different perspectives. For myself, I tend to go more towards the first one, or I would say spend a higher percentage of a given pen test on that first one. So I'll be thinking, like, going through the application and doing a bunch of activities that are related to what are the controls, which for most applications, those are going to be primarily authentication and authorization controls, right? And it could also be session management. You could throw that in there as well. And so I'll spend a bunch of time just focused on that aspect of an application. And then I might switch gears and spend some time looking for potential injection flaws. And then I'll look through and say, okay, well, think about the logic of the application. Like, is it a shopping cart or something like that has, things that have to happen in a particular order according to the application, but for which there's no technical control that would prevent it. And is it possible to manipulate the order of things, or maybe the timing of something that's being added? And then also another frame of mind, of course, is looking for information that's being exposed where it shouldn't be. And a lot of that could be just searching through your proxy history for, do you have something that is a secret in the application that somehow ended up in outbound requests to something else.
Right.
I very frequently go through looking for my login tokens and my burp history to see where it's going.
Where to go, yeah. Yep. So, but I want to take this second, if I could, Kevin, to also mention. I got to thinking about something, and so I should back up just a little bit and say we've written a white paper. I wrote a white paper on BILE as well, and there's a whole aspect of that I didn't include in the white paper that I thought about afterwards. So I think I should update it. If you look at the bypass, input manipulation, logic and timing, and exposure, each of those categories has different implications with respect to how effective automated testing is versus human testing on those.
Yeah.
Right. And they're very distinct. And that was by accident. I didn't even think about that when I was putting it together, but that's the way it works out.
So let me see if I have an idea of what you think the breakdown is.
Yeah.
Is that the first two, bypass and input manipulation, automated testing can quite often find at least the low-hanging fruit of that. But logic and timing and exposure is much harder for automated testing tools because they don't have the human aspect of what is the stuff that comes back. Would I be close?
That very much sums it up. I can get down a little bit further than that and say that that bypasses some of that can be done through scanning, but some of it's also human augmented automation. Like you can write a script that will help you. So you do want to add automation in there, but sometimes for the bypass ones, you need a little bit of human help. For input manipulation, you rarely need a lot of human help. Like there are scanners, DAS tools, and SAS tools that are able to locate input manipulation or injection type flaws, if you think about those.
Yeah.
Very effectively across applications. They don't always get everything. I'm not saying they're perfect, but they're a lot more effective than a person because there's usually a lot of different inputs to try, and it would just take forever for a person to try every single one.
Yeah.
And then you have logic and timing is almost entirely human driven. It's very hard to automate that. And exposure it's more like I don't know if you call it machine augmented human testers. Like you want that, but that's what I was saying. It's like you have your proxy history, so it's not going to be a person really doing all of the work. You're relying on tools to do a bunch of the work, but then the person is going to drive what you're looking for because
that makes sense.
A person knows, hey, this is actually something secret I care about. The program doesn't know until you tell it.
Okay. I think there's a lot of instances where I found exposure flaws in any way were almost entirely, or more often than not, I was led there because I noticed some output from one of the tools I was using. And the tool itself didn't pick up that this was an issue. But as I'm reviewing it and looking through it, I'm like, well, that's really interesting that they have that like that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I like it. Okay, so I'm going to ask each of you, and then I'm going to give my own answer in this case. I know I'm the moderator, but I'm going to inject myself as a in your expert opinion, and keep in mind that your expertise is different pieces here.
Yeah.
In your expert opinion, which of the four categories is most likely to be a villain in a cybersecurity superhero movie? And I think we're experts because, one, we're cybersecurity people, but also we like us some supervillains. I'll let you guys decide who goes first.
Oh, man.
Oh,
At the risk of being a little inappropriate, I would say it would be Dr. Exposure.
oh my gosh, I was going there too. That's exactly what I was thinking.
I jumped on that one first because it was the most obvious.
I was actually thinking I didn't want to hear anybody say exposure because how inappropriate that is.
I was actually like holding myself back. I'm like, don't say exposure. You're on a work call. People are watching you, Jennifer. Don't say anything inappropriate. But yeah, no, I definitely think it would be exposure because a lot of times that exposure itself is what leads me to finding the input manipulation or the bypass.
Okay,
the logic
I like that.
flaws.
I like that. So I actually disagree with you guys, but I disagree because of my oldest daughter's favorite movie, Megamind. I think logic and timing has already been a supervillain in Megamind. So that's where I'm going to go.
Okay.
So and I think the next question is actually tied directly to the content you wanted to post next, and that is how does the BILE schema interact with or incorporate, you know, like the OWASP top 10 or SANS's CWE top 25? How do you match? Because I will talk about my own ignorance. When you first brought BILE up and started talking about it, I could not divorce myself from the idea that BILE was a replacement for the top 10, which it's not. You've clarified that to me. But how would you have them work together or incorporate each other?
Okay, so my perspective on this is the problem, not that it's a problem, but the problem that we're solving with BILE is we're giving ourselves a schema to group our frame of mind for doing a pen test. The OWASP top 10 doesn't do that very well at all because it's a list of vulnerabilities, and it's not comprehensive, right? These are the top 10 vulnerabilities in recent years. That's what it's meant to cover. So you can take anything from the OWASP top 10 will easily fit into one or more of the BILE categories, depending on what made up that particular vulnerability. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the relationship as I see it. I've put together a crosswalk. I also did a crosswalk of the 2017 OWASP top 10 because it was a little different. And I did a crosswalk of the SANS top 25. All of those are in the white paper. We'll have the link for that in a minute.
No, that makes sense. I like that. I think this is, and maybe it's just because of my own ignorance when you first brought it to me, but I think this is a key idea. And one of the reasons why I struggled with the difference was that the OWASP top 10 in 2021 is so drastically different as an overarching thing than the 2017 or the 2013 versions. And we've talked about this multiple times that, if we look at the top 9, they are categories of findings, not specific findings. Obviously 10 is a specific finding added by poll, but
I was gonna say that one got voted in. The rest of them,
that was my snarky.
The rest were data driven.
Yeah. So I think that I like that idea that this becomes a way to classify those individually. Jumping a little bit with that, do you, with OWASP top 10 or whatever, with the Samurai project, which you're one of the leads to, I'm a little biased toward that myself. Do you see ways that we can take BILE and incorporate it into Samurai, or do you have a pull request ready or thought about for the OWASP top 10 to help incorporate this into that?
I think that's an interesting idea. I don't have one right now. I think that there's definitely room for that, though, because it goes back to, like I was saying at the beginning, and then Jennifer kind of reiterated that she does the same thing, is when we're looking at this from a training perspective, this gives us a logical grouping of different frames of mind that we can use when we're teaching, and that plays right into the Samurai web training framework or web teaching framework. I don't know. I keep going back and forth on what it really should mean. But that Samurai WTF is really, I mean, it's intended to be a way to set up labs for teaching web application security classes, and I think it just plays directly into that. So I could see us building out maybe, for example, a recommended curriculum, and what exercises map to BILE based on that.
It's funny you tie to something that's strong in my heart, and that is, you said a recommended curriculum, and I immediately go to OpenSBK.
Oh yeah.
So we'll just leave it at that, right? Like a thing I've been mulling about for a while, and I know you've helped with that as well.
It also plays into PTES and stuff like that. So
yes, yeah, definitely. Okay, so last question from me, and then if anybody else has any others. So the last question is, in the blog post about this, and you've kind of hinted at it here as well. You mentioned potential future enhancements. Now you've talked about one already. That you thought about the human automated aspect afterwards. Mm-hmm. Are there any other enhancements that you're considering, things that you're looking at doing that you're willing to share now, recognizing that we acknowledge these are random ideas that you may or may not have time to do?
So no, that's a really good point. So one thing I haven't looked very closely at yet, but I want to examine with it is how BILE may fit into other projects that are ongoing at OWASP. So one in particular is the OWASP testing guide. I think would be there's a lot of synergy there.
Makes sense.
And if you haven't looked at the OWASP testing guide, it's very detailed. It gets very technical into test. This is how you test for cross-site scripting. This is how you test for SQL injection. Like it gets into that level of detail, which is very, very deep. But I could see potentially looking at either mapping to BILE, or perhaps even in a future iteration of it, we use BILE as a like sort of a higher level grouping of those testing activities.
Okay.
Something along those lines, I think, would be a good application for it.
No, that makes sense. I like that. Okay, so I'm putting the link on the screen that you can download this from. You can get the white paper there. There is a blog in our blog. I do know, I want to say, our hope is that BILE, or some form of BILE, it's not a secure ideas idea. This is something we want to have people provide feedback and updates, and we would like to see this become something other people use instead of just something we like and put forward. So I'm gonna ask, is there any questions beyond the ones that have already been asked in the audience? So yes, this webcast is being recorded, and the recording will be available, and so you'll be able to come back to our system and get that. You'll be able to go, the link is up at the top where it says secureideas.com/webcast. Our future webcasts are there. And then this one, it will be public. We've talked about whether or not it's worthwhile also putting these webcasts into YouTube. I don't think we've come up with a final answer to that. But yes, the webcast, it will be recorded, will be available, will be out there for other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so, from my perspective, while we're waiting to see if there's any other questions, I mean, this is something that I've found very helpful, and I know that when I've spoken to others like Kevin and Jennifer, they've kind of jumped on it and said, "Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah. This is very helpful." So we just want to share it with the world, basically, and say, okay, if anyone else finds value in this, that's great. I'm glad we can help. So
yeah, definitely. Cool. Then in that case, I'm going to wrap this up. One, I appreciate y'all coming and listening to us for the last 45 minutes. I hope this was useful, helpful. Please don't hesitate. Reach out with questions, anything else that you need. We also have a full schedule. We're I think it's every 2 weeks for the next few months. We have a different webcast set up and scheduled. We also are doing a bunch of stuff with the anti-siphon group. We are out there and about and around. So if we can help with anything, please let us know. I'm Kevin Johnson, Jennifer, and Jason. Thank you very much for your time.
Glad to be here.
Cool. Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.